This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 7, Sessions, Seasons, and Scenarios in the Roll With It system. Hello friends, and welcome to yet another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Bracken.
Hey, everybody.
And we are in the middle of our sort of sub-series, if you will, in the season talking about the Roll With It system. We've been talking about how to set up scenes, how to make characters, how to develop them over time, generally how to play the game. And today we're going to be talking about sessions, seasons, and scenarios, kind of the various units, if you will, of time that we measure the game in. Now, Doc, do you want to explain the difference perhaps between a session and a season? Like how do episodes and seasons fit into sessions of play? That is the evenings we sit down once a week or whenever to play the game.
Yes. In fact, I'm not sure we even use the word sessions in the rule book.
We mention it.
Do we?
Yeah.
Okay.
But only to clarify that a session does not equal any of these units.
Right. And it's not a game term. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Thinking in traditional terms, just putting the traditional framework out, normally, whatever system you're working in, you would expect that you would sit down for a session, and that would be the time that you start playing the game to the time whenever, your friend kicks you out. And so what happens then is during that session of play, you might or might not have some kind of narrative arc occur. Hopefully you can. That's usually the goal. In fact, a lot of times, if you guys are like us, what you'll end up with is you've finished 15 or 20 minutes early, but you found a really good stopping place narratively. So what we'll say is, should we call it for tonight? And, then the answer is, of course, always no, and we go on for another 3 hours. But one of the things that's sort of hard-coded into the DNA of the Roll With It system is this idea of an episode. And we want to be really, really clear on this. An episode does not equal a session. Mm-hmm. Because if that's the case, you're either going to be playing so few cards that it's actually going to be really slow, mm-hmm. kind of boring, maybe. And you need to pick up the pace. Mm-hmm. Or it's going to be one of those things where you only had an hour to play.
Yeah.
So what we really have expected here is that there's going to be multiple episodes in a session of play. So that's the reason why we don't structure the game in terms of sessions, as many games do. Mm-hmm. So then that brings up the question, what is a campaign? And we think of a campaign as being a series of sessions in a traditional game. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, we don't really have a campaign structure either. What we end up having is a series of episodes that is what we would call, in American terms, a season of a television show or maybe a radio program or something along those lines, which then actually brings us into a really important element of decision, which is, when you sit down, are you guys telling a story that is akin to a movie? Or is this more like a TV series? Or is this more like the modern brand of TV series, which is like straight to streaming, and so 8 episodes is the full season? Looking at you, Stranger Things. That's totally viable. But the number that we've come up with to sort of solve this dilemma for us is 12. Mm-hmm. The reason why we came up with 12 as a number is because if you double it, you've got the standard sort of 24 episode season. So it's sort of the same as a half season, mm-hmm. right? Which is the sort of the old format for TV. Mm-hmm.
It's also, if you're an anime fan, that's about a season of anime too, is 12 episodes.
Well, yeah, actually it's sort of the European model, mm-hmm. is the 12 episode thing. But also we've discovered mechanically through rigorous testing that that's about the point where your characters get so overpowered.
And by that, we don't necessarily mean that they're overpowered mechanically. We almost mean that the players are overpowered because they have much better ability to control what happens.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Actually, that's the point where unless the group that you're playing with just loves to abandon things, or Epiphany, which is admittedly a lot of fun, and given the right tone, in the right setting, that can be the way you play the game, and it's epic. It's almost a Dragon Ball Z kind of a thing. But what you end up with, a lot of times with that 12 episode structure is these characters have reached their moment. And you are ready to have that climactic encounter with the boss, or the fight with the dragon, or the solving of the mystery, or whatever it is. And if you've been playing it about an hour per episode, that's also 12 hours worth of play, which means that, let's say that you got together 4 weeks, you only met every other week, and you got together for 3 hours each time. Oh, that's a good 3-month stretch there. You're now at that point where okay, let's finish this, what we would traditionally call campaign, and move on to another one. And so that's the end of season 1. And then you go through the season cleanup stuff, and then you can start a new season, or you can go on to another game, or do whatever it is you want to do. But your story for that season, for that arc, has been told. So let's work backwards and call that the story arc C, the overall season story arc. And then that brings us to, okay, well, what's story arc A and what's story arc B? So you want to throw in on that?
So going off of that TV show example, where you've kind of got, that's the overarching story of here's kind of the big thing that's happening throughout the season. I guess story arcs A and B would be kind of either the personal stories that are happening. So some of the side plots that may or may not span the entire season, or they'll at least span multiple episodes usually. Yeah. So that brings up a little bit of the character growth that we were talking about in the previous episode.
Yes.
Or story arc A, which is kind of the what is the issue for this episode, or this little group of episodes.
Yeah.
And so we know that ultimately what we're trying to do is get to Mount Doom and destroy the ring. But along the way, there are a lot of little plots that happen.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's 17 steps to get from Bag End to Mount Doom.
Yeah.
And so each of those steps can kind of be its own little story arc. And now that might be as little as 1 episode. It might be, 3 episodes, something like that. It might be 6. It all kind of depends. And I think it's worth mentioning, too, that the reason why we went with an episodic format, there's actually kind of 2 things. One is that in Roll With It, we do episodes. We sort of have this target of making each of our episodes approximately 30 to 60 minutes. If it's such an especially sort of epic story, sometimes it'll go longer. We've had a few unplugs where we play basically 3-hour session and trim it down to 2 or something like that. True. But for our standard show, Roll With It, we shoot for now usually about 40 to 60 minutes per episode, give or take. And so we wanted to be able to have a game that sort of let us have a structure that supports episodes, so that we could be sitting down to record and get to the end of an episode and call that a wrap and be able to reset and do a new episode without kind of arbitrarily trying to find a place to cut the story down.
Yeah.
Everybody knows when the end of a scene is, when the end of an episode is, so you can kind of all work together to get to a certain point narratively.
Yeah.
Which is the other reason that we do this. We have especially a season episode limit, so that everyone knows when the end is and can all sort of work towards something satisfying that has resolution by the end of that season.
Exactly. There's something so cool about everyone at the table knowing, okay, this is the last scene of this episode before everything resets. And then also this really amazing thing when you're on episode 11 or 12 and you're like, what's going to happen in this episode? Because wow, resolution and end of the season, and everyone's sort of moving towards, and you can feel that. And there's just something different about that than your standard dungeon crawl. Are we at the boss's room yet? Kind of a feeling, because the mechanics are about the narrative. They're not about the crunch.
So that kind of brings us up to our question of why 5 scenes per episode? Why 12 episodes per season? You already touched on the 12 episodes per season because it's kind of inspired by TV formats, because mechanically in the testing, we kind of found that was a good number. And what's funny actually is that on the show Roll With It, while I can see us sometime in the future doing a nice 12 episode season of something, in season 4, we actually just did 5 episodes because we wanted to have a little bit of a shorter story. Yeah. So we went into it knowing that we had 5 episodes to get done what we need to get done, and we built our story around that.
Yeah, we did.
So,
and it's worth mentioning that we really only had one abandonment and one epiphany by episode 5. And that's been what we've found, is that it has taken 4 or 5 episodes to get to a point where a character is sort of willing or ready to do that. And so what you end up having in that example is actually what we would call a B story arc. And if we had kept going with that, of course, that mild spoiler alert here, that's a bit of a circle. And so it closed the loop on that story we were telling, being a time travel story. It would be difficult for us to continue on. But if we did somehow keep going, I could see that being a new story arc that would begin and new elements that would continue and so on.
And if we wanted to make it longer, we also could have found a way to stretch things out. So like maybe we get to a certain point, but then another complication comes up where there's now this new element that's going to carry us from episode 5 through episode 12.
That's a really good point.
Or maybe even just making each of those steps along the way take longer. And that's another great thing too about having a certain number of scenes per episode, is you can kind of count on, and this was another reason we did this for our show, was that we want to be able to look back on an episode and say 5 things happened with confidence, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Whereas we'd have a few episodes before where like a conversation takes 20 of the 30 minutes and you look back on it, it's like, okay, that was an interesting conversation, but not much else happened.
Yeah. And as an audience and not a player, what you've done is you've shifted the agency there. And sometimes the things we do as players that are really exciting, just watching, can be incredibly boring. If you've ever watched someone play a video game and you're like, why are you just going around town? That's great. Then you know what I'm talking about here. But there's another reason for the 5 too, I think. And it's simply that if you look at some of the story models like Freytag's Triangle, you've got the 5 elements of a short story. And we tend to think of these episodes as short stories that are strung together like a string of pearls. And yet the scenes are also a bit like strings of pearls from character perspectives. And so, Freytag specifically, what you've got is you've got a conflict or an inciting incident, and then you've got rising action, and then you have at that point the climax, the climactic moment. And in American sort of film and television, then there's this very quick falling action and resolution. We're talking like 5 minutes at the end of the movie sometimes. And it's funny because if you look at even westernized versions of books and things like that, they will just crop that stuff way down. And then you enter into something like the extended edition of Lord of the Rings on Blu-ray and DVD. And what you have is like 20 minutes of falling action, and it fades to black, and then there's another conclusion, and fades to black, and there's another. There's like 7 times, and you're like, wait, I thought that was. Is it over? No, it's not over. It's still not over. It's still not over because we Westerners, we have a hard time with it now, which is interesting. When the climax really traditionally happened, especially in a 3-act structure, which preceded the 5-act structure. It happened in the middle.
If you think of the climax as the great turning point of the story, and then what you're doing is taking your time and sort of showing what that turning point results in.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we tend to think of it as, well, actually we sort of misplace it as resolution. So in the sense of playing as a session of play, which then would be multiple episodes, you can actually think of it in terms of that A or B story arc where in and of itself, it's going to have that pattern of beat, 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 where the episode is itself going to be inciting action and then rising action. You may have a whole episode that's just rising action in the terms of the characters.
Scene 5 is the climax or something like that.
Well, and maybe there's just a cliffhanger. And it's not the traditional climax in that sense. And what you end up with is then over the course of multiple episodes, you end up with that, what we would think of as a traditional narrative arc. And if that happens, then you need to start thinking, okay, maybe I'm not doing a monster of the week here. Maybe I'm not doing a mystery of the week here. Maybe the episodes are not their own self-contained stories, but this is more like let's call it a mini series. The thing that we're fighting, there's not going to be resolution on that C story arc until the end of the season. And then who knows, if you're planning on continuing, there might even still be beyond that, another further cliffhanger of a different sort.
And then, kind of to piggyback on that point, if you, as you said earlier in the episode, or if you're thinking of this series as a movie as opposed to a series or a mini series, you could also think of each of the episodes as acts.
Yes.
Or maybe like multiple. For instance, we've often found that the first couple episodes, the first 1, 2, 3-ish, often will go very quickly because we're all kind of getting a feel for what the story is and who our characters are, that sort of thing. And so you'll sort of get through a few episodes that kind of feel like not a ton really happened, or they don't feel quite as satisfying, or maybe they just went quicker than you were expecting. And so, we'll sometimes call that like, the 2-part pilot episode or something like that, to use a TV equivalent. Or maybe it's just an act 1 where we're kind of getting to that inciting incident. And then once we've hit the inciting incident, we kind of know where we're going.
Yeah.
Then that story, like everything kind of like locks in and we get our pace down and everything goes from there. So, don't feel like just because the unit is called an episode, it has to be treated like, any given episode of TV that you're used to.
That's true. In fact, sometimes you might feel more inspired by the Eastern structure and things like that than necessarily a traditional Western 5-act play, 5-scene, that sort of thing. But it is worth mentioning that is the reason why we chose the number 5.
There's also another consideration, which was like, it's one of those things where like it worked out nicely both ways, but we built the hand sizes and stuff like that around the idea of there being 5 episodes per scene.
That's a very good point.
Or five scenes per episode. Because 5 is just kind of a good number. You can hold that number of scenes in your head for that unit before like you start to get lost and like, wait, what happened back in scene 1, that sort of thing. So there's that consideration, but there's also that 5 scenes make sure that nobody runs out of cards.
That's right.
It kind of like helps us to, with our hand size, make it as likely as possible that as long as someone's not buying into scenes constantly, which is totally a valid way to play, that they can get a little bit of time in the spotlight.
Yeah.
So if someone is kind of like, I really want to, that thing happens where you're playing an RPG and if it's kind of open-ended and you don't have like the moment when this character is brought in, and a good GM will make sure they keep everyone involved. But if you have someone who's a little bit more quiet versus someone who's like very forward and like they're just constantly like, oh, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. There's those people who can kind of get relegated a little bit to the back seat and like not get really to participate.
Yes.
And there's some people who are cool with that. They just sort of enjoy being there and kind of contributing where they can. But this sort of makes sure that moment, that person's going to have their moment.
Yeah,
in the spotlight.
That's absolutely right. Well, if you'll indulge me in a math moment here, says the humanities guy, what you start with typically is going to be 3 cards with 3 stars or some mathematical equivalent of that. In order to have then 6 cards that have star value, it's going to take you 6 episodes in order to be able to get those stars, even if nothing else happens. Or maybe narratively, I should say, if everything goes your way and you get no extra stars, right? So here you are, it's episode, let's call it 7, which is the turning point in the season from the halfway point. And now what you have is the ability to affect every single scene that you can buy into. And also, whenever you have your opportunity to start a scene, you can self-assist. So you have that perfect number of 5 + 1, which is 6, to be able to have cards that have mechanical value, and you can do it. And so that was a huge influence on our decision. 6 cards, 5 scenes, 12 episodes, 1 season. It's beauty.
It worked out nicely. So yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this is like we kind of went a little bit into some of like the thought behind why we have certain numbers of things. Kind of an interesting point, but you don't need to worry about it in the course of the gameplay. The important thing to keep in mind is that you want to reach some sort of resolution, or at least some sort of some place where it makes sense to lead from one episode to the next by the end of the 5th scene. Yeah,
you really want something to have happened in the episode.
Yeah.
Preferably 5 things.
Yeah. But it could be also like, 5 things that are leading up to kind of like what that episode is about.
Yeah. New information counts as a thing in this context. So I would simply point this one sort of final thing out by way of closing up this idea of sessions, seasons, and scenarios. And it's this. A lot of games out there have a structure that is tacked on to the mechanics of their game. I don't hate on these systems. In fact, some of my favorite systems do this, where they say a certain type of scene could be an interlude, or it could be a this, or it could be a that. And maybe you should have 5 scenes and then do it this way. And that's what a session should be. And here's how you should tree your structure of your, and I get why they're doing that. It's so that they can have that feeling and that structure of the TV show, which we have also obviously subscribed to.
In which that helps certain groups who might not be quite as good at structuring things that way.
Yes, absolutely.
I think our group that we play with a lot tends to do that just because we've played with each other for so long.
And it happens very naturally.
Yeah.
Especially since we get the feeling and the sort of the tempo of what would happen in an episode next, no matter what system we're playing.
Right.
But I do want to stress this point, and it's this. We have worked very, very hard to make sure that we have balanced this mechanic for you so that in order to play this right, so that it doesn't fall apart and it doesn't break, you really should stick to that 5 scenes and have the star value and the obstacle, and make sure the GM gets their cards in the right time and place, and work towards that, that episode ending, and make sure that you're getting the stars when you should get them. You're only getting 1 star in between episodes. And
importantly, working toward the season finale as well.
Yes, work towards that season finale. And ultimately, if you will subscribe and give the time to this idea, the philosophy behind a slow burn towards success, you're going to see and feel that sense of accomplishment at that 6th or 7th or 8th episode, when you do have that abandonment, when you do have that epiphany, and you have earned this through 6 or 7 or 8 hours of role play. And it really has ingrained itself into you that samurai sword, or the whatever it is, has become an almost a character in and of itself, a motif, certainly. And we chose that word very carefully. Motif is something, it's not just a motif for your character, it's a motif for the series, for the entire show, for the setting itself, everything, and it all intertwines into this wonderful and delicious thing that it comes. So my encouragement to you is to really think about the episode structure and the season structure as it is intended, and to stick to that, and get outside of that idea of sessions and scenarios, which is the typical mentality.
Yep. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone, for Season 1, Episode 7 of the Doc and Krueger cast, our discussion on sessions, seasons, and scenarios, and the Roll With It system. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Bracken and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.